Hello and welcome to another episode of Other Items of Interest. I'm your host, Jack Zablocki. This week, we've got psychedelics, more psychedelics, and even more psychedelics. Hope you like psychedelics. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to another episode of Other Items of Interest. I'm your host, Jack Zablocki. So, you may have noticed there was no show last week, and there's a very good reason for that, I promise. If you're a regular listener, the two shows prior to last week, I complained about quality of news articles. And I came to realize it wasn't so much the quality of the news articles as I was just bored doing the same thing over and over again, doing stories about dumb criminals, dumb cops, and the like. I've just grown very bored with the repetitive news and reading the news. So last week I couldn't even bring myself to go through the stories that I had set up, and I just decided not to do it. Simple as that. The stories weren't great for last week that I skipped. Here, let me read you some of the headlines. That's the other thing. Most of these stories, the story is in the headline, and it just feels repetitive and redundant to actually read the article if the whole story is right in the headline. So here we go. This is what we missed last week. Snake orgy shuts down part of Florida park. Swedish woman spots long-lost mixtape at art exhibition. Utah man busted for using mice hamsters to get free hotel rooms. Tampon tax exemption proposal gets Tennessee lawmaker in hot water. Salami larger than the Statue of Liberty. Russia's strangest reality show. Siberian quarantine videos. Armed gang steals toilet rolls in panic buying hit Hong Kong. Teen zipline rider showers Las Vegas tourists in urine. Adult film shot at Santa Monica Public Library during business hours. That's awful. Man to have threesome with two ghosts for kinky Valentine's Day. Sad thing is the ghost didn't even show up. He was left by himself. And then last but not least, woman posed as a photographer to drug moms steal babies. Yeah, it just feels like we do a lot of the same news over and over again. So this week it's going to be different. It's going to be quite different. This week we are talking about psychedelic therapy. And nothing but psychedelic therapy. We'll be talking about magic mushrooms and LSD and the health benefits that they have. There's going to be a lot of information. You might not find this entertaining at all. I really don't care. This is something that's interesting to me. And to continue doing this podcast, I have to do stuff that's interesting to me. So this week, it will be articles on psychedelic therapy. I hope you enjoy. It's very interesting information. And honestly, everybody, I mean everybody, should try mushrooms at least once in their life, in their lifetime. That's how strongly I feel about psychedelics. You may think I'm crazy, out of my mind, so be it. With that having been said, let's get on with the show. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. From scientificamerican.com, this article was published January 16th, 2020. Headline reads, Johns Hopkins scientists give psychedelics the serious treatment. The first research center of its kind in the country is bringing renewed rigor to the investigation of the drug's therapeutic uses. Psychedelic drugs, once promising research subjects that were decades ago relegated to illicit experimentation in dorm rooms, have been steadily making their way back into the lab for a revamped 21st century style look. Scientists are rediscovering what many see as the substance's astonishing therapeutic potential for a vast range of issues, from depression to drug addiction to acceptance of mortality. A frenzy of interest has captivated a new generation of researchers, aficionados, and investors, triggering some understandable wariness over promises that may sound a little too good to be true. But late last year, the highly respected institution Johns Hopkins University, U.S. oldest research university, launched a dedicated Center for Psychedelic Studies, the first of its kind in the country and perhaps the world's largest. With work now underway, the center is aiming to enforce the strictest standards of scientific rigor on a field that many feel has veered uncomfortably close to mysticism, and that has relied heavily on subjective reports. Early results have been promising and seem poised to keep the research on a roll. Psilocybin, a psychoactive compound found in certain mushrooms, the best mushrooms, and LSD were widely studied in the 1950s and 1960s as treatments for alcoholism and other maladies. They later gained a reputation in the media and the public eye as dangerous and became strongly associated with the counterculture. Starting in 1966, several states banned their use. In 1968, LSD was outlawed nationwide, and in 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, classifying that drug and psilocybin, along with several others, as having a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. But in recent years, a rapidly growing number of studies reporting encouraging results in treating depression, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder have brought them back out of the shadows, spurred on by positive media coverage. In a major boost to the reviving field, Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research is exploring the use of psychedelics, primarily psilocybin, for problems ranging from smoking addiction to anorexia and Alzheimer's disease. One of the remarkably interesting features of working with psychedelics is they're likely to have transdiagnostic applicability, says Roland Griffiths, who heads the new facility and has led some of the most promising studies evaluating psilocybin for treating depression and alcoholism. The myriad applications suggested for these drugs may be a big part of what makes them sound to many like snake oil. But the data are very compelling, Griffiths says, and psychedelics may not only hold hope for treating mental disorders. As Griffiths puts it, they provide an opportunity to peer into the basic neuroscience of how these drugs affect brain activity and worldview in a way that is ultimately very healthy. As author Michael Pollan chronicles in his 2018 bestseller How to Change Your Mind, researchers were examining the therapeutic effects of psychedelics in the 1950s, a decade before then. Harvard University psychologist Timothy Leary and his colleague Richard Alpert started their notorious study in which they gave psilocybin to students, ultimately leading to Leary and Alpert's dismissal from the university. In the 1950s to the 1970s, studies conducted with LSD, which acts on the same brain receptors as psilocybin, reported strong results in treating substance use disorders, including alcohol and heroin addiction. But when LSD became illegal in 1968, funding for this work gradually dried up. Most psychedelics research stopped or went underground. Griffiths and some of his colleagues helped revive the field around 2000, when they obtained government approval to give high doses of psilocybin to healthy volunteers. The researchers published a foundational study in 2006 showing a single dose was safe and can cause sustained positive effects and even mystical experiences. A decade later, they published a randomized double-blind study showing psilocybin significantly decreased depression and anxiety in patients with life-threatening cancer. Each participant underwent 2 sessions, a high-dose one and a low-dose one, 5 weeks apart. 6 months afterwards, about 80% of the patients were still less clinically depressed and anxious than before the treatment. Some even said they had lost their fear of death. Armed with these promising results, Griffiths and his colleagues turned their attention to other clinical applications. They decided to investigate tobacco addiction, in part because it is much easier to quantify than emotional or spiritual outcomes. Johns Hopkins researcher Matthew Johnson led a small pilot study in 2014 to see whether psilocybin could help people quit smoking. It was an open-label study, meaning the participants knew they were getting the drug and not a placebo. The work followed a classic model for psychedelic therapy in which the participant lies on a couch and wears eye shades while listening to music. Researchers do not talk to or guide subjects during the trip, but before each session they do try to prepare people for what they might experience. In Johnson and his colleagues' study, participants also underwent several weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy aimed at changing patterns of thinking, before and after taking psilocybin. The drug was given in up to 3 sessions, one on the target quit date, another 2 weeks later, and a third optional, yes please. The subjects returned to the lab for the next 10 weeks to have their breath and urine tested for evidence of smoking, and came back for follow-up meetings 6 and 12 months after their target quit date. At the 6-month mark, 80% of smokers in the pilot study, 12 out of 15, had abstained from cigarettes for at least a week, as verified by breathalyzer and urine analysis. A vast improvement over other smoking cessation therapies whose efficacy rates are typically less than 35%. In a follow-up paper, Johnson and his colleagues reported that 67% of participants were still abstinent 12 months after the quit date, and 60% of them had not smoked after 16 months or more. Additionally, more than 85% of the subjects rated their psilocybin trip as one of the 5 most meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. The team is currently more than halfway through a larger 5-year study of 80 people randomized to receive either psilocybin or a nicotine patch at the new Johns Hopkins Center. Recruitment for the study is ongoing. The exact brain mechanism by which the therapy appears to work remains unclear. At the psychological level, Johnson says there is evidence that the sense of unity and mystical significance many people experience on psilocybin is associated with greater success in quitting, and those who take the drug may be better able to deal with cravings. At the biological level, he adds, scientists have hypothesized that psilocybin may alter communication in the brain networks, possibly providing more top-down control over the organ's reward system. A team led by Johns Hopkins cognitive neuroscientist Frederick Barrett is now investigating further by using functional magnetic resonance imaging to measure brain activity before and after patients undergo the therapy. Like any drug, psilocybin comes with risks. People with psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia or a strong predisposition for them are generally advised against taking the hallucinogen. People with uncontrolled hypertension are advised to abstain as well because psilocybin is known to raise blood pressure. Although it appears to be one of the safest recreational drugs and is not considered addictive, there have been reports associating it with deaths, but these may have been the result of multiple drugs, impure substances, or underlying medical issues. In the smoking study, a third of participants experienced some fear or anxiety at a high dose of psilocybin, Johnson says, but he adds that the risks can be minimized by carefully selecting participants and administering the drug in a controlled environment. Smoking study results are promising, but Johnson says its relatively small size is a limitation. Also, subjects in such studies cannot compromise a completely random sample of the population because it would be unethical to recruit people without telling them they may be taking a psychedelic drug. Thus, participants tend to be people who are open to this category of experience and potentially more apt to believe in its efficacy. And it is also hard to tease apart the effects of psilocybin from those of the cognitive behavioral therapy in the smoking study, Johnson notes. He and his colleagues at the new center plan to conduct a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, the gold standard for medical investigations in the future. Johns Hopkins researchers are also starting or planning studies using psilocybin therapy for a wide range of other conditions, including opioid addiction, PTSD, anorexia, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, and alcoholism in people with depression. David Nichols, a professor emeritus of pharmacology at Purdue University, who was not involved in the recent Johns Hopkins studies but had synthesized the psilocybin used in Griffith's 2006 and 2016 papers, has been conducting research on psychedelics since the late 1960s. Back then, you could probably have counted on one hand the number of people in the world that were working in this field. There wasn't any money, there was no interest. Psychedelics were just looked at as drugs of abuse, he says. Now, there's a whole society set up to study these, with probably 150 international scientists working on it. Nichols said he has supported Griffiths and Johnson's work since its early days as they gathered the initial data that excited wealthy donors enough to fund the latest research. Philanthropic funding is the way it's going to be until the National Institutes of Health decide that this is a field worth funding, he says. There are still too many political considerations that are keeping that from happening, but eventually we'll get there. We'll get the institutional support. We're just not there yet. So that's how we're going to start out, and that's how we're going to keep going. Next story. And this next article comes to us from livescience.com. Published 3 weeks ago, doesn't give an exact date. Headline reads, Psilocybin, the magic ingredient in psychedelic shrooms. Psilocybin is the main psychoactive ingredient in hallucinogenic mushrooms, also called magic mushrooms or shrooms. There are over 100 species of mushrooms that contain psilocybin. Although people have been consuming magic mushrooms for thousands of years, the compound wasn't isolated until 1957, and it was produced synthetically a year later. Since 1970, psilocybin and psilocin, a closely related compound, have been listed by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Association as Schedule I substances, the federal government's most restrictive category. Despite these restrictions, recent clinical trials have found psilocybin to be a promising therapy for treatment-resistant anxiety and depression. Because of this, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has designated psilocybin as a breakthrough therapy, an action meant to accelerate the drug development and review process. So, where does psilocybin come from? There are over 100 species of psilocybin-containing mushrooms with varying potencies, said Matthew Johnson, an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, who studies psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin. Psilocybin mushrooms have long, slender stems, topped by caps with dark brown edges, according to the DEA. In the U.S., magic mushrooms are found in the southeast and Pacific Northwest, often growing in pastures on cow dung, Johnson told Live Science. They also grow in Mexico, Central and South America. The most potent species in the world is considered Psilocybe azurescens, which I cannot say, never have been. Usually referred to as Azzies. Maybe usually, maybe not, I don't know. But I've heard them referred to that before. Anyway, those are found mainly in the U.S. Pacific Northwest. In the early 1950s, an American banker and mushroom enthusiast named R. Gordon Wasson came across an indigenous tribe using psychoactive mushrooms when he was on vacation in Mexico, according to Drug Policy Alliance. Wasson sent samples of the mushrooms to Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist known for discovering LSD. Hofmann isolated the psilocybin from the mushroom Psilocybe mexicana in 1957, and he developed a way to produce a synthetic version of the psychedelic compound a year later. Since 1970, psilocybin and psilocin have been listed by the DEA as Schedule I substances, the federal government's most restrictive category. Drugs in this category are believed to have a high potential for abuse, as well as no accepted medical use, according to the DEA. Well, how does it work? Psilocybin, along with other drugs such as LSD and mescaline, are considered classic psychedelics because they can induce changes in mood, thought, and perception by mimicking neurotransmitters in your brain. Once it enters the body, psilocybin is broken down into psilocin, a substance that acts like the neurotransmitter serotonin, which regulates mood. Psilocybin is known to activate a specific type of serotonin receptor in the brain that triggers its psychedelic effects, Johnson said. Its hallucinatory effects can cause a person to see images, hear sounds, and feel sensations that seem real, but aren't, according to Partnership for Drug-Free Kids. I love all the sources for the information in this article. Anyway, someone on psilocybin may experience synesthesia, or the mixture of two senses, such as feeling like they can smell colors. Besides sensory enhancement and visual hallucinations, participants in psilocybin-assisted therapy sessions have described the drug's effects as a life-changing experience where they gain deep insight that shifts the way they think about themselves. A mystical type of experience has also been linked with the use of psilocybin, Johnson said. People have described feeling at one with humanity, feeling a sense of unity, and feeling a sense of self-dissolve after consuming the psychedelic compound, he explained. Studies have shown that after taking psilocybin, there is a sharp increase in communication between areas of the brain that normally don't talk to each other, which may partly explain the new insights people experience. There's also a quieting of deeply entrenched thought patterns that contribute to addictions, anxiety, and depression, Johnson said. Well, how do people take it? People have been ingesting psilocybin-containing mushrooms for thousands of years as part of religious ceremonies or for healing purposes. Magic mushrooms can be made into a tea, eaten raw or dried, ground into a powder, and put in capsules, or coated in chocolate to mask their bitter flavor and disguise them as candy, Johnson said. The hallucinogenic effects may begin within 20 to 40 minutes of use and last about 3 to 6 hours, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. Studies on the possible medical benefits of psilocybin and other psychedelics began in the 1950s and 60s, immediately after Hoffman created a way to produce the chemical synthetically. Although findings showed promise for treating anxiety, depression, and addiction, research in the U.S. came to a halt in 1970 when President Richard Nixon, not a fan, signed the Controlled Substances Act. This law was viewed as a political response to a growing fear of psychedelic drug use in young people and the spread of the counterculture movement. 3 decades later, Roland Griffiths, a psychopharmacologist at Johns Hopkins, won FDA approval to study psilocybin, ushering in a new era of psychedelic research with more rigorous scientific standards than earlier studies. When used in current research sessions, participants take a pill containing a high dose of synthetic psilocybin with professionals monitoring them and providing psychological support, Johnson said. They typically receive counseling before and after the psychedelic experience. The FDA has granted some scientists permission to use psilocybin in research, but the recreational use of psilocybin is illegal in the U.S. However, its illicit use has been decriminalized in 2 cities, Denver and Oakland, California. And other cities are working on similar measures, Johnson said. And we'll get to that later. Psilocybin therapy research. Psilocybin has shown promise for treating a variety of difficult-to-treat health conditions. For example, the results are extremely positive for the use of psilocybin in the treatment of smoking cessation and depression, Johnson said. Recent clinical trials have reported that just 1 to 3 doses of psilocybin given in conjunction with cognitive behavioral therapy have helped patients quit their smoking habit, he said. Afterward, people feel more confident in their ability to change behavior and manage their addictions. Results are also promising for the use of psilocybin in reducing cancer-related anxiety and treatment-resistant depression, 2 areas where there is a huge need for better treatment options, Johnson said. Psilocybin, along with supportive therapy, appears to help people come to grips with problems and learn from these experiences, he said. The treatment may induce insights and novel perspectives that promote mental flexibility and may cause lasting behavior changes 6 months to a year later. Small studies of psilocybin have also suggested benefits as a treatment for alcohol addiction and obsessive-compulsive disorder. And once again, potential risks of psilocybin. The most common negative side effect of psilocybin is the potential for a bad trip, Johnson said. High doses of psilocybin can cause overwhelming feelings of anxiety, fear, and confusion that can lead to dangerous behavior if not under medical supervision. Psychedelics are very intoxicating substances, and their side effects can be challenging to manage even in the relatively safe framework of a research setting. Researchers reduce these risks by prohibiting people with a history of psychosis from participating in psilocybin studies. Psilocybin can also moderately increase blood pressure, which is why people with heart problems are excluded from studies, he added. Other possible side effects of psilocybin include nausea, vomiting, headaches, and stomach cramps. For recreational users, misidentification of mushroom species is one of the biggest concerns. Some poisonous varieties of mushrooms in the wild bear a strong resemblance to psilocybin species, according to Project No. Inexperienced mushroom hunters might not recognize the difference and could accidentally ingest a poisonous mushroom, which could lead to liver failure or death. So there's a little bit of repeat information in this article, as there was in the previous article, but too much information cannot be a bad thing. Right? Let's move on. From psychologytoday.com, published December 26, 2019, headline reads, Treating Depression with Magic Mushrooms. Nice and to the point. Depression and suicide are major public health concerns. Our currently available therapies are not as effective as we might wish. The rate of suicide is increasing. There is an urgent need for novel and effective interventions for depression. Some psychedelics may show potential as an intervention for suicidality. The challenge for the patients and physicians will be to overcome the negative stigma associated with their use. A similar challenge continues to plague the widespread acceptance of medical marijuana. One promising psychedelic is psilocybin, which can be found in more than 75 species of mushrooms, the most famous being Psilocybe mexicana, aka the quote-unquote magic mushroom. Psilocybin is spontaneously converted into psilocin after ingestion. Psilocin is more lipid-soluble and the actual psychoactive agent. Recent PET evidence suggests that psilocin's psychoactive actions depend upon its availability to stimulate one specific serotonin receptor called 5-HT2A. To date, psilocybin has demonstrated modest, although some authors claim promising results in clinical trials for the treatment of addiction, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and death anxiety. Many different species of the psilocybe mushrooms also contain a range of tryptophan-derived beta-carbolines, such as harmane and harmine, that may also positively influence brain function. Why are the beta-carbolines important in the action of psilocybe mushrooms? Beta-carbolines are potent inhibitors of an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which is responsible for the inactivation of psilocin. And a lot of this doesn't mean anything to me, and I doubt it means anything to you, but let's get through it, shall we? This is fascinating behavior by any plant or fungus. The psilocybe produces a variety of different natural products via unique pathways that diverge from the same building block, i.e. tryptophan, leading to the production of dissimilar compounds, and all of these contribute directly or indirectly to the same pharmacological effects. Now that you know what is inside the fungus, why would anyone expect that psilocybin would be useful in the treatment of depression? In fact, no one would have ever expected that a 5-HT2A agonist like psilocybin could be useful for treating mental illness. To understand why that is true, it is necessary to appreciate the role of 5-HT2A receptors in the brain. For example, abnormalities in the structure and function of the 5-HT2A receptors may underlie the presence of schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, and drug addiction. These conditions are treated by drugs that block 5-HT2A receptors. The author says, let me emphasize that the last point, drugs that treat depression and anxiety act exactly the opposite of psilocybin. Maybe the benefits of the psilocybe mushroom are due to the actions of the beta-carbolines. The beta-carbolines, harmane and harmaline, produced an antidepressant-like effect in a recent animal study. Drugs that block monoamine oxidase have been used for many decades to treat major depressive episodes when other medicines have failed. They are not widely prescribed today because they all have a nasty side effect with a rather benign name, the cheese effect. If a person taking a beta-carboline or any monoamine oxidase inhibitor consumes foods that contain the amino acid tyramine, which is found in beer, cheese, and wines, their blood pressure can increase dramatically, leading to a hypertensive crisis, stroke, and death. Our knowledge of the complex actions of the contents of the psilocybe mushroom in the brain may one day lead to improved therapies for depression. However, we are not there yet. Almost certainly, those individuals with depression who do not benefit from standard antidepressant therapies may find benefit in using extracts of this mushroom as long as they can manage the risk of the cheese effect. And this next article comes to us from newatlas.com, published January 27th, 2020. Headline reads, Psychedelic Therapy Benefits Persist 5 Years After Treatment. One of the more compelling areas of research currently being investigated in the world of psychedelic science is psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to improve emotional well-being in patients with life-threatening cancer. A new study is offering the first long-term insights into the efficacy of the treatment, revealing a single dose of psilocybin in conjunction with psychotherapy is still offering persistently positive effects up to 5 years later. Dealing with the profound existential distress of a life-threatening cancer diagnosis is a major challenge for most patients. As many as 40% of cancer patients are known to develop clinically significant signs of depression or anxiety, and these mental health issues have been linked to worse treatment outcomes or, in some instances, suicide. Some of the earliest psychedelic studies in the 1950s and 60s explored the effects of LSD on depression, anxiety, and cancer patients before research in the area froze for several decades due to societal prohibitions. But post-2000 saw a thawing of regulations, and some of the most comprehensive trials to date have been investigating the potential for psychedelics in treating patients with life-threatening illness suffering existential distress. That is not something that sounds like it's fun. The acute results from these studies have been incredibly promising, but so far there has been little investigation into the long-term efficacy of these psychedelic interventions. In terms of psychedelic psychotherapy for patients with life-threatening illnesses, the longest follow-up study to date has been 12 months. A newly published study in the Journal of Pharmacology is offering some of the best long-term insights into psychedelic psychotherapy to date. The study follows a previously published investigation into a single moderate dose of psilocybin in conjunction with psychotherapy for patients with cancer-related existential distress. The 2016 double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study recruited 29 patients. By the 6.5-month follow-up point, between 60 and 80% of the patients displayed clinically significant improvements in depression and anxiety symptoms. The new study reports on 2 further long-term follow-up points investigating whether the effects of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy persisted for several years. Only 16 of the original 29 patients were still alive for the follow-up study, one of whom declined to participate and a second who died before the final follow-up date. This left 14 subjects to evaluate with an average final follow-up of 4.5 years. The long-term results were strikingly positive, recalling similar efficacy to the originally published study. Between 60 and 80% of the remaining subjects still fitted the criteria for clinically significant anxiolytic or antidepressant responses, and the vast majority of the subjects ranked the single psilocybin treatment as one of the most meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. It may be fair to suggest that it is unsurprising the long-term effects are so positive, considering around 70% of the surviving cohort were in partial or complete remission at the final long-term follow-up point. However, the persistent, meaningful experiences reported by the cohort in relation to the single psilocybin dose suggests long-term positive psychological effects can be attributed to the treatment. So not only does it seem the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy helps patients move through the acute months following a major cancer diagnosis, but the experience may be aiding the surviving patients in positively contextualizing the traumatic experience years later. The long sentences in this article are killing me. There's a reckoning, which came with cancer, and this reckoning was enhanced by the psilocybin experience, writes one of the patients 5 years later as part of the long-term follow-up questionnaire. I have a greater appreciation and sense of gratitude for being alive. Another patient quoted in the new study offers a compelling case that the psychedelic experience fundamentally changed their approach to the world. Again, this impression was nearly 5 years after the single psilocybin treatment. The psilocybin experience changed my thoughts about myself in the world. I see myself in a less limited way. I am more open to life. It has taken me out from under a big load of feelings and past issues in my life that I was carrying around. Gabby Agin-Liebes, lead author of the new study and co-author of the original 2016 study, keenly notes that these positive results seem to be due to the larger treatment regime of 9 psychotherapy sessions in conjunction with the single psilocybin dose. Agin-Liebes does not believe these positive results can occur from a single psychedelic experience divorced from the broader treatment method, and suggests the controlled therapeutic process is vital to the efficacy of this kind of psychedelic treatment. Psychedelic experiences are uniquely influenced by context in which they occur, Agin-Liebes tells New Atlas in an email. The importance of context cannot be overemphasized. Psychedelics are different from other psychiatric medications in that their benefits seem to be very dependent upon the context in which they are ingested. In more traditional medications, the persistent presence of the drug in the body affects biological process, which lead to psychological and behavioral effects independent of the contexts in which medication is taken. Exactly how a single dose of psilocybin in conjunction with psychotherapy confers such a profound and enduring effect up to 5 years later is still unclear. Agin-Liebes points to a recent paper from Imperial College London's Robin Carhart Harris and Carl Friston as the most compelling holistic exploration of the mechanisms underpinning these persistent positive effects. The most compelling and scientifically grounded theory relates to psilocybin's potential for inducing a flexible brain state, particularly people who experience more rigid brain states, explains Agin-Liebes. Psychedelics appear to relax the brain's biased patterns of information processing and beliefs and allow for more bottom-up information to enter into one's consciousness. A number of larger clinical trials are currently ongoing, exploring the potential for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to address major depression and various addiction issues, as well as further validating the treatment for existential distress related to life-threatening illness. The new study was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. From CNN.com, published February 3rd, 2020, Santa Cruz decriminalizes magic mushrooms and other natural psychedelics, making it the third U.S. city to take such a step. As mentioned in a previous article, Denver, Colorado, and Oakland, California are the other 2 cities, which I'm sure will be mentioned in this article. The city of Santa Cruz, California, has become the latest city to decriminalize magic mushrooms and other natural psychedelics, including ayahuasca and peyote. Ayahuasca, that's a substance we can do a whole show about. Actually, go listen to Joe Rogan. He'll bring it up any random episode. Anyway, the Santa Cruz City Council voted unanimously to approve a resolution that makes investigating and arresting people 21 and older for using, possessing, or cultivating psychoactive plants and fungi among the lowest priorities for law enforcement. Tuesday's resolution doesn't necessarily make it legal to use, possess, or cultivate natural psychedelics, but it does mean that the city won't be using resources to investigate or arrest people for doing so. The resolution only decriminalizes those activities at a personal level, meaning commercial activities could result in penalties. Santa Cruz is the third city to take such a step. Denver voted to decriminalize psychedelic mushrooms in May of last year, while Oakland decriminalized all psychedelic plants and fungi shortly thereafter. The resolutions or ordinances passed by Santa Cruz, Oakland, and Denver don't apply to drugs such as LSD or MDMA, which are synthetic. Chicago is among other cities considering a resolution to decriminalize certain psychedelics, and efforts to enact similar measures are underway in some states. In Oregon, a campaign called PSI 2020, or Psy 2020, I assume, is lobbying for a measure on the ballot that could make the use of psilocybin, the hallucinogenic compound found in psychedelic mushrooms, legal statewide. If the measure passed, the Oregon Health Authority would oversee a program that would allow psilocybin to be administered in licensed therapeutic environments and supervised by trained professionals. People would not need a mental health diagnosis to receive therapy, according to the language in the measure. We think that this is a novel approach that could help alleviate the mental health crisis here in Oregon by addressing epidemics like suicide, treatment-resistant depression, and anxiety, PTSD, and addiction to drugs, alcohol, and nicotine. Psy Chief Petitioners Tom and Sherry Eckert say on the campaign's website. Additionally, the measure would open doors for new research and create access to services for those interested in personal development. A campaign for a similar measure on the ballot in California is also underway after it failed to get enough signatures last year. That measure would decriminalize personal possession, use, and cultivation of psilocybin statewide for people 18 and older. Last year, Iowa Republican State Representative Jeff Shipley introduced 2 bills in the legislature to decriminalize psilocybin use for medicinal purposes and remove it from the list of Schedule I controlled substances. Natural psychedelics have long been popular for recreational use, though many have been banned at the federal level for decades. The U.S. Department of Justice classifies psilocybin as a Schedule I controlled substance, which means that federal policy states that it has no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. If you've ever done mushrooms or LSD, it's pretty rare that you're going to have a high potential for abuse. I just don't think it's something that happens. Anyway, that's a story for another time, a topic for another time. Let's continue with the article. But a growing body of medical research suggests that psilocybin can be used to treat conditions such as anxiety and depression in cases where drugs currently on the market cannot. It has also been found to have a low potential for abuse and no potential for physical dependence. As I was saying, a 2017 study published in the journal Nature showed that 47% of patients experiencing treatment-resistant depression showed positive responses at 5 weeks after receiving a psilocybin treatment. And in 2018, researchers from Johns Hopkins University called for removing psilocybin from the list of Schedule I substances. And here we have the top 10 psilocybin studies of the last decade from synthesisretreat.com, blog.synthesisretreat.com. The renaissance of psychedelic research continues to gather pace, with an ever-growing number of studies amassing that explore the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. Of these, psilocybin has been taking the limelight, and for good reason. It appears to show great promise as a treatment for several psychiatric conditions, while also having the potential to lead the betterment of well people, as Bob Jesse put it, one of the people behind the sparking of the modern psychedelic research renaissance. Amid a flurry of studies in recent years, a number highlight psilocybin's multifaceted potential. Some say that this increase in the last decade was sparked by the pivotal study called Psilocybin Can Occasion Mystical Type Experiences in 2006, led by Roland Griffiths and a team at Johns Hopkins University. The study employed a rigorous design and looked at the effects of high doses of psilocybin on spiritually interested people who had never taken a psychedelic before. Psilocybin reliably occasioned mystical experiences very similar to those reported occurring spontaneously by mystics going back through the centuries, with the majority of participants describing these experiences as among the most personally meaningful and spiritually significant of their lives. The mystical experiences that high doses of psilocybin can reliably occasion are deeply tied to the enduring benefits that people report across studies. Mystical experiences are characterized by a number of traits, including deeply felt positive mood, transcendence of time and space, and a profound sense of unity, infusing life with a renewed sense of purpose and meaning. So here's a look at synthesisretreat.com's top 10 scientific papers of the last decade, selected because they provide an expansive overview of modern research on psilocybin, highlighting its multifaceted potential, both as a psychiatric treatment and as a catalyst that can enhance the lives of healthy people in a number of ways. Number 1, addiction to smoking. long-term follow-up of psilocybin-facilitated smoking cessation, Johnson and Griffiths. Following the results of a few pioneering studies, psilocybin shows great promise in addiction treatment. Johnson et al.'s 2017 study looking at tobacco addiction yielded impressive results that far surpass any mainstream treatment options. At 12 months post-experience, 67% of participants were smoking-free and 86.7% rated the experience as among the most meaningful of their lives. Interestingly, some participants reported that their enduring smoking abstinence was among the least interesting outcomes of their experience. Number 2, addiction to alcohol. Psilocybin-assisted treatment for alcohol dependence, a proof of concept study. I'm not going to read all the names. This was done in 2015. Psilocybin has also been examined as a treatment for alcoholism. One study found it to be highly effective, with enduring abstinence tied to the intensity of effects experienced. While the results of these latter two studies appear impressive, it is worth noting that they are both small proof-of-concept studies with small sample sizes and no placebo-controlled group. In both cases, more rigorous Phase 2 studies are currently ongoing to better evaluate psilocybin's addiction-breaking potential. Number 3, psilocybin treating depression. Psilocybin with psychological support for treatment, resistant depression, 6-month follow-up. A bunch of names, Carhart Harris being the main one. Also, David Nutt, who is very important to the just drugs in general, really. Is British scientist. This study was done in 2018. Psilocybin appears to show great promise in the treatment of depression. A follow-up study of the first pioneering trial exploring this reported that at 6 months post-session, 31% of participants with treatment-resistant depression reported enduring antidepressant effects, with reductions in depression again tied to the quality of the psychedelic experience. Numerous more extensive and rigorous studies are currently ongoing around the world. Number 4, bad trips or challenging experiences. Survey study of challenging experiences after ingesting psilocybin mushrooms, acute and enduring positive and negative consequences, 2016. While numerous assessments have found mushrooms to be the safest of all substances, at times they can yield highly challenging experiences. Carbonaro et al.'s study found that 39% of people rated their worst experience as among the 5 most challenging experiences of their lifetime. However, 84% of people endorsed the experience as having benefits. While psychedelic experiences are sometimes characterized as being bad or good trips, this shows that labeling such experiences in such a binary fashion is a limited way of categorizing them. Number 5, therapeutic mechanisms. Patients' accounts of increased connectedness and acceptance after psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Watts, Nutt, Carhart Harris, 2017. A 6-month follow-up study which assessed participants from their latter psilocybin-depressed study revealed 2 of the critical therapeutic aspects of the psilocybin experience. These were a shift from a sense of disconnection from self, others, and the world to connection, and from a state of emotional avoidance to acceptance. This was in contrast to more conventional treatments participants had tried previously, which tended to exacerbate disconnection and avoidance, showing psilocybin works through novel means. Number 6, psilocybin and existential anxiety. Long-term follow-up of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for psychiatric and existential distress in patients with life-threatening cancer. This was the study we talked about previously in a previous story. 3 separate studies at UCLA, Johns Hopkins, and NYU explored the potential of psilocybin to treat existential anxiety in terminally ill cancer patients. They built up the strongest evidence base by far for any indication against which psilocybin has yet been tested. Not only was a single psilocybin experience found to be highly effective in the majority of participants, the benefits also appeared to be highly enduring. A follow-up study of surviving NYU participants conducted 4.5 years later reported sustained antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects, with participants considering their experiences as among the most deeply profound of their lives. Number 7, effects of psilocybin on creative thinking, empathy, and well-being. Subacute effects of psilocybin on empathy, creative thinking, and subjective well-being. Mason, Mishler, Utog, 2019. Beyond it being a potentially paradigm-changing treatment for a number of hard-to-treat mental health conditions, psilocybin also holds value for otherwise healthy people. This study used a treatment setting to assess the effects of psilocybin on creative, convergent and divergent thinking, empathy, and life satisfaction the morning and 1 week after psilocybin sessions. Even at lower doses, psilocybin was still capable of enhancing convergent thinking, empathy, and well-being up to 7 days later. Number 8, increasing connection to nature. Increased nature relatedness and decreased authoritarian political views after psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, 2018. Lyons, Carhart, Harris. Another study investigating how people's values changed after psilocybin experiences found that people were less prone to authoritarian views and reported feeling more connected to nature up to a year later. This is an important finding as one's connectedness to nature is strongly associated with a broad range of traits associated with psychological well-being. It enhances some of the benefits obtained from spending time in nature and strongly predicts pro-environmental behavior. Could this mean that taking psychedelics could lead to a stronger desire to protect nature? They have an article on connection to nature to find out more. I think we'll be getting into that later. Number 9, lasting positive effects of a mystical experience and integration. Psilocybin occasion mystical type experiences in combination with meditation and other spiritual practices produces enduring positive changes in psychological functioning and in trait measures of prosocial attitudes and behaviors. Once again, Roland Griffiths, 2018. A number of studies have suggested psychedelics yield more benefits when used alongside existing practices. This study found that the mystical experiences from psilocybin in combination with spiritual practices such as meditation and journaling produced enduring shifts in prosocial values and behavior while promoting healthy psychological functioning. Number 10, enduring positive effects in healthy people. That's right, you don't need to have cancer, anxiety, depression, PTSD, have a smoking habit, or be an alcoholic. You can be perfectly healthy and have positive effects with psilocybin. Acute, subacute, and long-term subjective effects of psilocybin in healthy humans, a pooled analysis of experimental studies, 2011. This paper pooled data from 8 studies where a total of 110 healthy volunteers were administered psilocybin between 1 and 4 times, and it looked at the acute, short-term, and long-term subjective effects psilocybin produced. Psilocybin was well tolerated and considered pleasurable, enriching, and non-threatening by participants. Negative reactions were very rare and can be managed by interpersonal support, and there were no prolonged negative reactions reported. A number of enduring benefits were reported 8 to 16 months later, including a greater appreciation for art and music, and changes in people's relationship to nature. And that is the 10 studies that synthesisretreat.com likes, and I think they're pretty nifty as well. From SciPost.org, new study finds psychedelic drugs result in lasting increases in nature relatedness, published January 7th, 2020. New research provides evidence that psychedelic drugs produce enduring increases in people's sense of being connected to nature. The findings, which have recently been published in International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, indicate there is a causal link between psychedelic use and nature relatedness. A lead author of the study, Sam Gandy, a collaborator with the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, told SciPost he has a lifelong love of nature and PhD in ecological science from the University of Aberdeen. I have a growing interest in how and why people become connected to nature and the implications of this. Profound experiences of nature connection appear to be a common, if not fundamental, property of psychedelics, and it was interesting to examine, he explained. Nature connection, or relatedness, is an interesting thing to look at scientifically as it is strongly correlated with a broad range of measures of psychological well-being, while also being a strong predictor of pro-environmental behavior. So it's an interesting and topical area given the burgeoning concurrent mental health and ecological crisis we are facing, with there being a recognized lack of effective interventions for reducing people's environmentally destructive behavior. For their study, the researchers used online advertisements to recruit 654 individuals who were planning to use a psychedelic drug in the near future. The participants completed scientific questionnaires 1 week before their psychedelic experience, and then 1 day, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and 2 years afterward. Gandhi and his colleagues found that the psychedelic experience was associated with increases in nature relatedness. Specifically, the participants agreed more strongly with statements such as, "My ideal vacation spot would be a remote wilderness area. My relationship to nature is an important part of who I am, and I feel very connected to all living things and the earth after having consumed a psychedelic drug." Increases in nature relatedness or connection, the degree of one's self-identification with nature, were found to be positively correlated with concomitant increases in psychological well-being, and amount of lifetime psychedelic usage was correlated with level of nature relatedness at baseline, Gandhi told SciPost. Post-psychedelic increases in nature relatedness were found to be enduring, measured at 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and 2 years post-experience. Increases in nature relatedness were also found to be mediated by ego dissolution experiences occurring under the influence of the psychedelic, along with access to natural settings during the acute experience. As with all research, the study includes some limitations. Given that this was an observational study, this comes with limitations such as lack of experimental control, such as verification of drug dose and purity, and the particular natural settings people had access to. The recruitment criterion of the intent to take a psychedelic substance may lead to an unavoidable bias towards psychedelic use and likely greater openness to new experiences in general. The sample was predominantly highly educated and male, impairing the generalizability of the findings, Gandhi explained. However, the findings are in line with some previous research. A cross-sectional survey of 1,487 individuals found that people who had used psychedelics tended to have higher levels of nature relatedness. An analysis of a small group of patients who used psychedelics for treatment-resistant depression also indicated the drugs can change how people feel about the natural environment. Psychedelics are very powerful substances, and their beneficial application is determined by the set psychological context and the setting socio-cultural context, framing their usage, Gandhi added. In modern clinical studies involving psychedelics, careful screening of study participants is conducted to ensure participants with a diagnosis or family history of certain forms of mental illness, such as schizophrenia, are not included so as to ensure safety and eliminate the possibility of the psychedelic experience exacerbating underlying mental health issues. Psychedelics certainly aren't necessary to increase nature relatedness. The direct sensorial experience of the nature is sufficient for this, so nature-based activities and time spent in nature, in addition to nature-based mindfulness practices such as forest walking and Japanese forest bathing, are great ways of increasing our connection to nature while yielding a range of additional benefits from nature immersion, Gandhi said. This Gandhi sure loves the run-on sentence. He just rambles on. Good information, though. So there are a number of ways cultivating our connection to nature, and given the importance of this connection, enhancing it should be considered an urgent priority by our species, he said. The study From Egoism to Ecoism, Psychedelics Increase Nature Relatedness in a State-Mediated and Context-Dependent Manner, was authored by Hans Kettner, Sam Gandhi, Eileen Heijen, and Robin L. Carhart Harris. here we are with our last story of the show from Vice.com. Headline reads, "This is what happens when you take 550 doses of LSD at once." Accidental LSD overdoses are not fun, but for some, they can have a bizarrely beneficial effect. This article was published February 21st, 2020. Around 10 p.m. at a summer solstice party somewhere in Canada on June 20th, 2000, about 20 people swallowed glasses of water mixed with the powerful psychedelic LSD. A decimal place error caused them to take about 10 times more of the drug than they thought they were getting. For the 12 hours that followed, they would ride out one of the most intense experiences of their lives, one that would change them forever. Gram for gram, LSD is more powerful than most recreational drugs. While most substances like MDMA or cocaine are active at the milligram scale, the effects of lysergic acid diethylamide, I can never say that, just call it LSD. LSD manifests at the microgram scale, or 1/1,000,000th of a gram. An average hit of LSD is 100 micrograms. A trip can sometimes last 12 hours or more, pumping up heart rate, intensifying colors and sounds, and altering the perception of time. Because the LSD molecule, which mimics serotonin, has a lid that locks into serotonin receptors, it can remain there for hours. This is how low concentrations of the drug can be so potent. Because of this sensitivity, it can be easy to overdose on LSD. But what happens when people take extreme amounts of LSD? This is the subject of a new report co-authored by Mark Hayden, the executive directors of MAPS Canada, and an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia, which looked at extreme cases of LSD consumption, revealing some bizarre health outcomes. One of the cases covered in Hayden's study was that of a 15-year-old girl with bipolar disorder. She was one of 20 people who accidentally OD'd on acid at the summer solstice party in Canada. She took a whopping 1,100 micrograms. For the next 6 hours, her behavior became erratic. She lay on the floor in the fetal position, tightly clenching her arms. Her friends thought she was having a seizure and called an ambulance, although no one was sure if she was actually seizing, lost consciousness, or was just lost in the overwhelming experience. The next morning, her father visited her in the hospital. She told her dad, "It's over." He thought she meant the acid trip. She clarified that no, her bipolar illness, which had caused daily manic episodes, seemed to be cured. A week later, her symptoms had still not returned. Doctors followed her progress for over a year, and nearly 2 decades later, she still hasn't experienced episodes of depression or mania outside of postpartum depression. Looking back on the overdose, she said it felt like her brain chemistry had somehow been reset. Hayden says he was not only amazed that her symptoms resolved, but that such a high dose could ultimately be a positive experience. In this report, published in the Journal of Studies on Alcohol and Drugs, Hayden also includes the story of another individual at the infamous solstice party, a 26-year-old woman who only took half a glass, approximately 500 micrograms of LSD. Unbeknownst to her, she was 2 weeks pregnant. Yet she experienced no pregnancy complications, and her son, now 18 years old, is perfectly healthy, bright young student. The most remarkable case study included in the report is the 2015 story of a 46-year-old woman who Hayden calls CB, who had chronic pain caused by Lyme disease. CB snorted a line of white powder she thought was cocaine. 15 minutes later, she realized something was wrong and called her roommate, who told her what had happened. She had inhaled part of his stash of LSD. While LSD usually comes in a blotter form, tiny pieces of paper dabbed with scentless clear liquid acid, the drug can also come in a potent white powder form and is not hard to confuse with other powdered drugs. CB's roommate weighed the remaining powder and estimated that she had snorted up 55 milligrams, 550 times an average dose, enough to get an entire school tripping on acid. It was a roller coaster megatrip that would last 34 hours. The first 12 hours were hellish. She mostly blacked out and vomited frequently while being looked after by her roommate. For the next 12 hours after that, CB said she felt pleasantly high, mostly sat in a chair, frothing at the mouth, occasionally vocalizing random words, and vomiting frequently, according to Hayden's account. When the drug finally wore off another 10 hours later, CB felt normal, and her chronic pain had completely disappeared. For 7 years, she had been taking morphine every day to treat symptoms of Lyme disease. After her LSD overdose, not only had her pain evaporated, she felt no withdrawal symptoms from the opioids she had been taking. CB stopped taking morphine for 5 days, and then her pain did return. She then reduced her dose of opioids and started microdosing LSD, taking about a quarter of a typical dose, or 25 micrograms, every 3 days for a few years before completely stopping the morphine in January 2018, again without withdrawal symptoms. There is some evidence that psychedelics like LSD can treat pain because they are anti-inflammatory drugs, but Hayden was surprised it could help with opioid withdrawal symptoms as well. I heard somebody say that he thought LSD would be good for withdrawals, but I've never seen any evidence of it, he said. There's almost no evidence LSD may help with bipolar disorder, let alone cure it. Eilert Waldman, author of A Really Good Day, claims microdosing LSD helped manage her mood disorders. A clinical trial in Switzerland is currently recruiting people to look at LSD to treat manic depression. Otherwise, there's not much there. CB's trip isn't the most intense LSD overdose recorded, or even the first time someone mistook LSD for cocaine. In a 1972 report published in the Western Journal of Medicine, 4 men and 4 women each snorted 2 lines of white powder that was acid, not cocaine. It's hard to estimate how much they took, but blood samples range from 1,000 to 7,000 micrograms per milliliter. That's between 260 and 2,100 hits of LSD. 10 minutes later, all of them ended up in the emergency room. 5 were comatose, while the others were extremely hyperactive with severe visual and auditory hallucinations, according to the report. 3 patients stopped breathing and needed to be put on ventilation machines. Other symptoms included diarrhea, vomiting, bleeding, blood clots, and fever. The cocaine, which they had also taken, could have caused the bleeding. Most likely. All 8 patients survived and fully recovered less than 12 hours later, most with no memory of being admitted to the hospital. The study authors stated that no apparent psychological or physical ill effects were noted in a year of follow-up examinations of 5 patients. Most of the patients continued to use LSD intermittently. While there's never been a recorded death from LSD directly, the authors estimated that a lethal dose of LSD would be around 14,000 micrograms. People do sometimes take too much of a psychedelic and stumble into traffic or out of a window. It's also possible to die from overdosing on drugs like, I don't know how to pronounce this exactly, so I'm just going to say the letters, 25I-NBOME, which often looks like acid blotter but can be deadly, which underscores the importance of knowing what drug you are ingesting. Overall, this points to the incredible relative safety of LSD, which is regularly confirmed in clinical trials. It's a remarkably safe product. It's unusual, Hayden said. Albert Hofmann, the first scientist to synthesize LSD in 1938, said it was one of the least toxic drugs on the planet, and that kind of is consistent with David Nutt's toxicity data. That's just another reason why it shouldn't be criminalized. It's remarkably non-toxic. So there you go. There's our show on psychedelic therapy. This was different. It was interesting. Not particularly humorous, but a lot of good information. So, now that we're done with that, we will be saying goodbye. It's the end of our show, and we hope you come back next week for some more psychedelic talk. Until then, we say adios, auf Wiedersehen, sayonara, goodbye. This has been Other Items of Interest, and I've been Jack Zablocki. If you'd like to visit us online, you can do so at www.otheritemsofinterest.com. You can email us at otheritemsofinterestpod@gmail.com. And there's also Instagram and Twitter, but I really don't give a shit. I just absolutely hate social media. I just can't take it anymore. It's so meaningless and shallow. Let's not get into this now. We're at the end of the show. I want to get on with my life. You need to get on with your life. So let's cue the music. Welcome to the end of the show. This has been Other Items of Interest. I've been your host, Jack Zablocki. This is where we say goodbye. We say goodbye to everybody listening. We say farewell, goodbye, see you later, see you next week. We'll miss you. Bye-bye, everybody.